Well, for this past month, we've been considering our relationship to creation in light of the signs of climate change that we see, but also through the lens of the Hebrew prophets and the parables of Jesus. Now, since we too are creatures living together in this balance of creation, our relationship to one another falls under this larger umbrella of creation care as well. So today we're going to look at some of the stories that Jesus tells to bring our attention to what matters to God. And as usual, Jesus has been, sort of messing with people's beliefs and their assumptions. And as we've seen through some of these stories we've told over the last month or so, he's on a roll. He's been throwing out one parable after another. There was that shepherd looking for a lost sheep, and there was that woman searching for a coin she couldn't find, and there was that dad waiting on the front porch watching for his son to come home. And Jesus has been telling these stories that suggest that God loves everyone, and especially those who seem to be lost or outcast. And then he gives us this story that we're looking at today, and it seems to suggest that we don't necessarily know who is lost and who is found. It was this story of the rich man who is dressed in purple and fine linen and has everything he wants to eat, and by his gate is Lazarus, covered in sores, who's just hungry all the time, hoping for crumbs from his table. And the poor man dies and goes to be with the ancestors, with Father Abraham. And that rich man dies, but finds himself alone and tormented and able to see Abraham and Lazarus. And he begs for help. Send the poor man to cool my tongue with water. But Abraham says it is impossible, for there is this great chasm that is fixed between us. We kind of know this story even if we haven't read it from the Bible ourselves, because it is a part of our culture. And we think that we got it. We're pretty sure that the selfish rich guy should have been more generous. That's the moral of the story, right? But first century listeners would not have understood that. They actually would have been very confused by Jesus' parable. They would not have assumed that the rich man was evil or that the poor was righteous. On the contrary, wealth was believed to be a sign of God's favor, and poverty was viewed, it's an evidence that somebody has sinned. Jesus here is questioning this interpretation of Scripture. We like to say, just read the Bible, and we find it's not that simple. Now, Barbara Lundberg explains how detailed Jesus is in making this point. The rich man dressed in purple and fine linen. The poor man is covered not with linen, but with sores. So, the rich man was feasting, and the poor man was looking for crumbs. Deuteronomy 28, we read the words, "If you will obey the Lord your God, these blessings will come upon you." And the verses describe wondrous blessings of fruit from the ground and meat from the cattle, glorious prosperity gospel. And the rest of that chapter in Deuteronomy is filled with curses that come on those who do not obey God. The Lord will strike you on the knees and on the legs with grievous sores, of which you cannot be healed, from the soles of your foot to the crown of your head. So Lazarus looks exactly like the one who was cursed by God. And according to, this way of reading Moses and the prophets, the great chasm would be the poor man's fault, for he certainly had disobeyed God. The rich man doesn't have to do anything for this person lying at his gate. Jesus is turning their beliefs upside down. He is arguing directly against that interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures. For in Deuteronomy, God also tells the people, "You shall open wide your hand to your brothers and your sister, to the needy, to the poor," reminding people to leave some grain in the fields for the poor and the widow and for the illegal alien. Isaiah asks, what does true fasting mean? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, and when you see the naked, cover them, and do not hide from your own people in need? So it's no secret now where Jesus comes down on this. When the poor man dies, he is sent to be with their ancestor, Father Abraham. Jesus is stating, Poverty is not a sign of disobedience, and wealth is not a sign of faithfulness. It was this poor, hungry Lazarus, not the wealthy man, who is embraced by Father Abraham. So this story is about how we read our scriptures, and it's how we see and how we relate to and how we interact with those around us. In life, the rich man walked by poor Lazarus, who was sitting outside of the gate of his subdivision. He saw him, but he never really saw him, because his expectations was that this guy is not worth seeing or knowing or helping. In the afterlife, he recognizes Lazarus and calls him by name, but he still treats him as if he was a servant. He asks Abraham, "Send him down here to bring me some water. Send that poor servant beggar back to warn my brothers." The rich man continues to fail to see Lazarus as a person, as an equal, as someone with his own needs and own value. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. preached on this parable in 1965. He saw as a point of the parable, the rich man was in torment not because he was rich, but because he passed by Lazarus every day and never really saw him. Because he allowed Lazarus to become invisible. Because he failed to use his wealth to bridge the gap, that gulf that separated him from his brother Lazarus in his lifetime. And he didn't even realize that Lazarus was his brother. Now, in that same speech, King included some famous phrases when he says, "This is the challenge facing the church, to be as concerned as Christ about the least of these, our brothers and sisters. And we must do it because in the final analysis, we are all to live together, rich and poor, lettered and unlettered, tutored and untutored." And he continues, "Somehow we are tied in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. For I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what ought to be. This is the way God made the world. We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish as fools." Something we're starting to see in our world, on our planet, with our environment now. But we know that this is not what we have been taught. It's not how we were raised or reared or brought up. We might not think that we believe that God rewards the good, hardworking people with wealth and curses the weak as sinners with poverty and illness, but that really is what our culture teaches us in so many ways. We are taught to admire billionaires, and, well, we're encouraged to be like them, or at least get as close to them in the hopes that their celebrity might rub off on us a little. We have been taught from childhood that if someone looks poor, well, they're likely to be dangerous, so you should avoid them. And the best strategy is to move away from poverty-ridden neighborhoods and just keep moving away. And whatever you do, don't make eye contact. The rich man passed by Lazarus every day and never really saw him. He allowed Lazarus to become invisible and nameless, just a beggar, just a servant, nothing more. Now, when we read this parable, we tend to identify either with Lazarus, like, I'm one of those people who barely has enough to eat, or, well, I know I'm kind of like the rich man because I do have enough clothes and plenty of food and maybe sometimes bad vision when it comes to people. But maybe who we really are now are the brothers who are still alive, who have choices to make about how we live in this world. When the rich man asked for someone to go and warn his brothers before it's too late, Abraham says, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead." Well, we believe that someone has risen from the dead to show us the true character and love of God. And yet, a prosperity gospel is still alive and well, and telling Christians, well, that if you're wealthy, you're blessed, and if you're poor, well, you must deserve it. So now what does this have to do with our consideration of creation and climate change? Because I know that here in this congregation, we do see the people around us in need. And we do what we can to help. And we learn each other's names. But it is harder to respond to those who are farther away from our doorstep. Because we also know that the devastating effects of climate change are hitting those in poverty the hardest. Those of us living in this Western world, well, we have the largest carbon footprint. We use more electricity and more gas and more water and more of all of the resources. But it is those who use the least amount of fossil fuel and electricity, those who are least wasteful with meat production, they are experiencing the damaging results of climate change first, and they are hit the hardest. So when we begin to see ourselves from this broader view of the systems that sustain us, we realize that we are the rich man ignoring the problems of Lazarus outside our gate. Philip Alston points out that global warming tends to intensify economic and racial inequities. We risk a climate apartheid where the wealthy pay to escape overheating and hunger and conflict, and the rest of the world is left to suffer. Not happy thoughts, but the world that we live in, the world that we want to not see and not recognize. And the reality is that we can't escape the culture that we live in. It is not possible for most of us to just go off the grid and try to live without all these things. We are encased in a society that requires driving by cars to get to jobs. But we can choose to really see those being harmed by climate change. And there are things that we can do. We can use our power of vote to vote for leaders who are trying to shrink our carbon footprint. We can vote with our dollars by buying sustainably produced products. Our diet and our food choices have a large impact on our carbon footprint, again, by reducing your meat intake, by buying local products, lessening your food waste. You can help the planet begin to be healthier. We don't often think about it, but the fashion industry produces 10% of all of humanity's carbon emissions, and it is the second largest consumer of the world's water supply. So, investing in some sustainably made clothes, buying secondhand, I can recommend some really good consignment shops, and then just reducing the amount of shopping that we do, we can have a positive impact on our planet. We can use public transportation, we can bike and walk to places when we can, and when we need to use our cars, we can invite our friends, our family, our colleagues, ride together, just beginning to have fewer vehicles on the road. Working from home has made a great impact when our workplaces allow us to do so. We can speak up and advocate for those we know who are already suffering under the weight of this climate challenge. We are called to care for creation. We're called to care for creation because God called it all good. And because we are in this life together. We are sharing one planet, one environment, all inextricably interconnected. There is no escape from the future that is coming. We are called to care for creation because we are all deeply loved by our Creator. This will continue to be our call, and we work together to do what we can and to see those who need to be seen. Now let's continue to praise our Creator in song.